Welcome, everyone. We will give everyone a few minutes to sign in, and then we'll get started. So I'm going to go ahead and get started, and anyone can join as we continue. Welcome to our webinar series hosted in collaboration between the Ability Center of Greater Toledo and Lucas County Board of Developmental Disabilities. We are so glad that you're here. Our series is focusing on parent, guardian, and caregiver resources, and part one of our series is waivers and funding sources. So just to get started, we have an ASL interpreter on screen. Kathy, thank you for being here, along with our moderators and panelists. And we have closed captioning available. You'll see the option in your bottom right of your Zoom screen. So if you want to click on that, you'll have the option for captioning as well. The webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be available on the Ability Center's website as well as Lucas County Board of Developmental Disabilities website. So without further ado, Heather is going to introduce our first panelist.
Good morning and welcome to everybody. I am happy to introduce Michelle Meyerholtz. She is currently the Assistant Superintendent for the Lucas County Board of Developmental Disabilities. She's been with the board for over 17 years. She previously worked as a service and support specialist, a habilitation coordinator, an SSA coordinator, and assistant SSA director as well. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Heather. So happy to be here. Welcome, everybody. Bear with me just a moment as I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay.
Looks good on this end, Michelle.
Wonderful. So I'm here to give an overview of waivers, and so just real quick to share, because I know we only have an hour today. As Heather said, I work for the Lucas County Board of Developmental Disabilities. We have a wonderful mission where we're trying to help make sure that we are improving life so that individuals with developmental disabilities can reach their full potential. And so one of those ways is, potentially with some funding. So I think, do we go about this, Heather, where you're going to ask me some questions and then I go through my PowerPoint?
Yeah, we can start off that way. And so the first question that we wanted you to address, Michelle, was just giving us an overview of what the different DD waivers are.
Okay, so there are currently 3 different waivers that are available through the developmental disabilities system. And so waivers, they're called home and community-based services waivers. And the 3 that are administered by county boards of developmental disabilities, here, as you can see on their screen, one's called the Individual Options Waiver, or IO waiver, you might hear it called for short. Level 1 waiver, or the Self-Empowered Life Funding Waiver, or SELF waiver, you might hear that also kind of abbreviated like that.
Awesome. And so tell us a little bit about each of those waivers, if you would.
Sure. So I'll start with the IO waiver. So With the IO waiver, funding is available for that based on an assessment called the Ohio Developmental Disabilities Profile. This, or ODDP for short, the SSA that works for the county board would administer this assessment. And this assessment basically looks at what people's different strengths, abilities, things that they may need some assistance in, and they kind of it puts people in a funding range based on the answers to the questions. So based on the needs that a person has, the state has kind of determined that, you know, individuals with these specific needs would typically fall into this kind of funding range or amount of money that would be needed to provide their services and meet their health and safety needs. The funding range really is meant to be a guide to help a person's team determine how much service a person needs. Sometimes the funding range, it may not be enough money to serve a person because of some maybe additional circumstances or things that have happened. And so if that were the case, there is the ability for the county board to request from our state department, the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities, something we call prior authorization, which means we can request to go over that funding range to access some additional services based on that person's needs. And then also through the IO waiver, so the ODDP determines how much money is available for services like homemaker personal care, respite, and other things like that. There's kind of a separate pot of money, if you will, that is for things like adult day services or employment services, and then transportation to get to and from those services. So that is a separate monies that the state has identified for people that would like to utilize those services. And that also has a separate assessment that is completed called the Adult Acuity Instrument. And that instrument looks specifically at what happens when a person is going to a day service program. Like, what are some of the steps, and how much support does a person need to accomplish those steps? And so that assessment focuses specifically on that. And then the outcome of that is also kind of puts somebody into kind of a funding range. And then we can build out supports based on that. The level 1 waiver, that's a little bit different. This has more set funding amounts, and there is no ability for us to request prior authorization from the state. So somebody's needs would have to be met within the specific funding limitations that this waiver has. And so just a quick review of what those are. And not all of these, so level 1 waivers kind of have three pots of money, if you will. One of them is the second bullet point there. You can see a maximum of $6,750 per year. So that would renew annually for services like homemaker personal care, respite, community respite, which is like camp, and some other things like that. There's also, just like the IO waiver, there's also a separate funding or pot of money, if you will, for adult day and employment services, and then transportation to get to and from those services. The same adult acuity instrument assessment would have to be completed, and that money, that funding, also renews on an annual basis. And that's kind of considered part, it's a separate amount of money, but that's kind of part of that $6,750 per year. So they automatically get that if they have those needs. There's also, I call it there's not really a name to it, but I call it the ancillary services kind of pot of money, and that is $7,500 every 3 years. And there are specific services that are covered under that, and that's going to be things like environmental accessibility adaptations, kind of some things like that that aren't necessarily ongoing regular services that a person might need. That money, that $7,500, only renews every 3 years though. There's also emergency funds available in the amount of $8,520 every 3 years. And that would be for most of the things that are covered under that that $6,750 pot of money, where you can get like the HPC, and that ancillary pot of money, that's $7,500. Most of the services under those pots, if you will, again, you could access that emergency assistance money to get more services. So say something happens and, you know, God forbid a caregiver has a health issue and maybe has to go to the hospital. And so an individual needs to utilize respite. The $6,750, maybe of that, there's only like $1,000 left to be used for respite, and that's not enough money. We would be able to access that emergency assistance money to be able to have some additional money to pay for respite. So I hope that makes sense. I know this is kind of very complicated and trying to explain it in a very short period of time. And just to explain the 3-year period of time that the emergency funds and the ancillary services, so those both renew every 3 years. That 3 years starts with the date that they get their waiver. It's not from the date that they first use funds from one of those pots. It's 3 years from the date they get that waiver. And the county board would be able to help you know if you've used money from that and when, and so then how much money you would have left and when that 3-year period renews. And then lastly, the self-waiver. This also is kind of a more set pot of money, and it is based on whether somebody is classified as a child or an adult. And per rule, the definition for child is being under the age of 22 and being served by their local school district. So children have a $30,000 funding cap per year through the self-waiver, and adults have a $45,000 funding cap per year. Unlike the level 1 in self, or I'm sorry, the level 1 in IO, the self-waiver, this is all the money that there is for a person's services. So this would have to cover all of their needs. There is no separate funding if somebody wants to access adult day services or employment services. All of it. So if I have a self-waiver and I want to go to a day service program, the money that I need to pay for that service comes out of that $45,000. There's no separate monies like there is with the level 1 in IO.
Thanks, Michelle. So who is eligible for a waiver and how do they go about applying for one?
So eligibility for a waiver, and this is the same for all 3 waivers. There's a couple additional things for the self, but I'll go through those here in a minute. But for all 3 waivers, a person must be eligible for Medicaid, and they must also meet the developmental disabilities level of care. You might hear us. We are the system of abbreviations or acronyms, and so you might hear somebody say the LOC, which means level of care. So to meet level of care, that means that a person must have 3 functional limitations as determined by the level of care assessment. They must also be eligible for ICF-DD level of services. So ICF stands for Intermediate Care Facility for the Developmentally Disabled level services. So if they meet level of care and they're eligible for county board services, then they would meet that ICF-DD level services. And then they also have to, they're basically kind of agreeing, if they want a waiver, that means they're waiving their right to live in an ICF facility in order to receive services that are community-based out, from a provider out in the community. And we also have to ensure that an individual's health and welfare can be met by the waiver. And that could be in conjunction with natural supports and other community resources. But we, by rule, can't enroll people on a waiver unless we can ensure that that waiver is going to meet their health and safety needs. So that's for all three waivers. Now, there's a couple additional things for the self waiver. With the self, they must, at minimum, have to need one self waiver service. And then they also must be able to engage in participant direction for at least one of the services. So that means that participant direction is them kind of having that decision-making authority with certain services, and they really take on that responsibility to manage that service.
Wonderful. So how would someone apply for a waiver?
So applying for a waiver, in order to obtain a waiver, when the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities a couple years ago, they revised the process. And I know one of the panelists is going to talk in a little bit about the waiting list rule or waiting list assessment. So when they revised that a few years ago, it kind of changed how a person applies for a waiver. So in order to obtain a waiver, a waiting list assessment would have to be completed by an SSA that's trained to complete that assessment. And we must complete that assessment within 30 days of a request for an assessment. So if you were to contact us and say, I really want to have a waiting list assessment completed, we would have 30 days to get that assessment done. There are 3 potential outcomes from that waiting list assessment. So it would be, a person would be found to either have an immediate need, a current need, or no unmet needs. If a person is found to have a current need, then we would place the person on a waiting list. And current needs mean that that most likely they would have a need, an unmet need, within 12 months of that assessment being completed. So we would put them on the waiting list. If it's determined there are no unmet needs, then the person would not be placed on the waiting list because there's no needs that are showing to be unmet. And then if the determination of that assessment is that somebody has an immediate need, then the county board, has 30 days to figure out how to meet that need. And in another slide or two, I talk a little bit more about what that means. But no matter the outcome of the waiting list assessment, we provide all individuals with their right to due process so that they know that they have the right to appeal that decision or that outcome of that waiting list assessment, no matter what that outcome is.
Wonderful. So Michelle, what is a provider? You've talked about that a couple of times. What is a provider?
So a provider And I'm sorry, Heather, let me back up a second. This is my own fault here. Going back real quick to just the outcomes of the waiting list assessment.
Oh, absolutely.
I'm so sorry. So sometimes when somebody has no, and the assessment might say they have no unmet need, but they might feel that they do. Technically the process is over and they wouldn't be put on a waiting list or whatever. And yes, we give them their appeal rights, but we would encourage folks to continue to work with their SSA for service coordination to see if we, whatever the need is they feel is unmet, we would still want to try to address that no matter the outcome of the assessment. And I did kind of explain the current need about the 12 months and the immediate need about the 30 days, but just to go slightly further into some folks think that just because you are identified as having a current or immediate need, that automatically means that a person will get a waiver. And that's not necessarily the case. That could be the case. But when you look at the rule that kind of governs that and how we are to approach that, a waiver is one of the options to meet that current or immediate need, but it also talks about how we might be able to use a combination of community-based alternative resources or alternative services such as an ICF, living in an ICF facility. It's an option. It's not certainly forced or anything like that. Natural supports, or like I said, a waiver. So there's a number of ways that we might try to meet that need. And that may or may not be with a waiver. So I just wanted to clarify that real quick. So moving on to your question of who can provide services, that's a great question. So only those folks who have gone through the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities provider certification process can provide a waiver services. So somebody, whether it's an agency or an individual person, they would have to go through that process and be a certified provider in order to be able to provide waiver services. So, you know, if I'm a family, if I'm a parent, I wouldn't be able to just pick my neighbor to provide services to my child, no matter age, whether it's a minor child or an adult child, doesn't matter. I wouldn't be able to just pick my neighbor. I would have to pick somebody who is certified through the Ohio Department of Developmental Disabilities to provide waiver services. And they have to be certified for each particular waiver service. And in the next slide, I'll show you what all of those different services are. But for each waiver service, a provider has to be certified for that service in order to provide through the waiver that service. So providers can be certified as either independent or agency providers. Agency providers can hire staff, can hire, we call them direct support professionals that will go out and provide the service. An independent provider is a person, as an individual, is the actual certified provider. Independent providers cannot hire staff. They actually have to provide the service themselves.
So what are those services, Michelle? You referenced that you had a slide for that. What kinds of services can people expect to get?
So the list here on the slide are all of these services that the three waivers provide. And let me clarify that not all three waivers do not provide each and every one of these services. Some waivers, for instance, if you see support brokerage on there, that is only a service available through the self waiver that is not available through the individual options or level 1 waivers. So this is a list of all waiver services that could be provided so long as it is a part of that waiver. We certainly can provide a specific breakdown of which waiver provides which service, but I unfortunately, I wanted to just be able to fit them all on here so folks could see what all the potential options are. But we can, if folks really want to have that breakdown per waiver, we certainly could provide that information.
So if I've got a waiver, I can have all of these services at the same time, or are there stipulations on that?
Well, that is not really a yes or no answer, actually. So you can have more than one service at a time. So if I have homemaker personal care service, so that service where somebody comes into my home and kind of helps me live with my daily living skills and just help me get through the different things of my day. I might also receive residential respite, which is I go receive respite somewhere. Maybe my caregiver, you know, I live with family, maybe my caregiver is going out of town and I'm not going with them, so they need some respite services for me. And maybe I also go to a day program, adult day support program, and receive the non-medical transportation to get there. So a person can receive a combination of services. There are some funding caps with particular services. So for instance, support brokerage with the self-waiver, only so much of the person's self-waiver can be spent on support brokerage. The same goes for like home delivered meals. I can only receive home delivered meals if I don't have a person that lives with me that can provide that support for me. So if I have direct care staff that are coming in and I receive basically 24-hour supports, I can't get home delivered meals because I have direct care staff who are supposed to be providing that meal support as part of my HPC service. And if I am receiving home delivered meals, I can only receive up to 2 meals a day. I can't receive all 3 meals. So there are some limitations to what a person can receive. And I know that it's kind of overwhelming and confusing. So folks, the SSA that is assigned to a person can totally help you navigate that. You know, as you're trying, if you get a waiver, or if, you know, even if you've had one, things often change, and so your SSA can help you navigate that and know what you can get and how much of that you can receive.
So Michelle, someone in the Q&A asked, what is support brokerage? What does that actually mean?
So support brokerage is a service that a person might need to help with the participant direction piece of the self-waiver. So if an individual who has a self-waiver needs help with making decisions and things like that, then they could pay a support broker. They could use that support brokerage service to have that support. Clearly, obviously, that would take funding away from being able to use other things. So a lot of people don't necessarily, there are some people who have a paid support broker, but a lot of people just use a natural support as their support broker.
Okay. So if a person has a waiver, what happens if they don't use all of their funding? Do they lose that waiver, or what does that look like?
So that kind of gets into the broader idea of authorizing waiver services. So the county board will authorize services based on assessed need and medical necessity. So the CMS, the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare, have put as part of the rules that govern these waiver services is that there has to be a medical necessity to receive that service. So we authorize services based on a person's assessed need and the medical necessity for that need. Which also means it's very individualized to the person and their needs. So just because, like, say you and I live beside each other, Heather, and we both have a kid that has a waiver, my kid may get very different services than your kid because our kids have different unique needs. And so just because one person is getting a particular waiver service doesn't mean that everybody else also is eligible to receive that waiver service, because it's based on a person's unique needs and unique assessed needs and the medical necessity for that support. So SSAs, the service and support specialists, really cannot authorize a service if there's no assessed need and there's no medical necessity.
All right. Thanks, Michelle, for answering so many of those questions this morning. And I believe Dawn said it earlier that we have the PowerPoint, and Michelle also did a kind of frequently asked questions sheet that's going to be attached to this webinar recording. So that'll be on the website with all of it together. Thanks again, Michelle.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Along with Michelle, we also have Rebecca Steinhauser from ABLE with us today. Rebecca is a 96 graduate of the University of Dayton School of Law. She started her career as an AmeriCorps attorney at Advocates for Basic Legal Equality. She specialized in housing issues from 96 until 98. In 99, she was hired as a full-time attorney at Legal Services of Northwest Ohio, and she specialized in public benefits, benefits planning, and elder law. She's been the managing attorney for healthcare and public benefits at ABLE, which is Advocates for Basic Legal Equality, since July of 2013. And over the past 20 years, she's done numerous trainings and presentations, really focusing in the area of public benefits and elder law. Along with Rebecca, we also have Jane Wagner with us from Area Office on Aging. She directly supervises assessors, including Ohio Home Care Waiver, the Medicaid specialists, pre-admission review, and she has oversight of passport and assisted living CM supervisors. Jane has been at Area Office on Aging since 1993, and prior to that, she was a nursing facility director of nursing. So we are thrilled to have both of you with us today. And Rebecca is actually going to speak to us about what the new waiting list process is for the waivers.
Thank you, Dawn. And Michelle did touch a little bit about this already. So some of you may be familiar with the old process that was in place before September of 2018. And at that time, under the old rule, anyone who asked for a waiver could be placed on a waiting list. And so you can imagine how long that waiting list was. And people were on that list for years and years waiting for waivers. So they changed to this new waiting list assessment rule. So in every county in Ohio, the new waiting list assessment rule became effective back in September of 18. And that new rule says that a county needs to do the waiting list assessment and decide whether a person needs waiver services. So Michelle touched upon current needs. So if you're found to have a current need and that's not being met by what they call alternative community-based services, you will be placed on the list. If you have an immediate need, the board needs to figure out how to meet that need within 30 days. As Michelle also mentioned, that may be through a waiver, but that may be through some other mechanism of services. So alternative community-based services, you're going to see that come up quite a bit when you apply, when you get a waiting list assessment. So all that means are just various programs, services, and supports other than waivers that exist that could help you. So that could be services from the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency. It could be Medicaid state plan services. It could be some special kind of county or state funding. So there's guidance that came out from the State Board of Developmental Disabilities that says that when the county's looking at whether those resources are actually available, they need to determine that the resources are actually available and that they're successfully meeting the person's needs. So if you're denied and the reason for the denial is that you have alternative community-based services and you don't think those are meeting your needs, then I would really encourage you to file an appeal. I'll give you an example that we had out in Richland County. We had a single mom not getting much help from ex-husband. She was getting child support, but he's out in California, doesn't see the children but 2 weeks every year. The children are 5 and 8. They're extremely high needs. They're mostly nonverbal. They have issues with violence against each other, against classmates, against adults. They are not toilet trained. They can feed themselves sometimes, but not always. They destroy property in the house. They don't sleep on a consistent basis. So you can see where mom doesn't have a lot of family support. So what we were getting for her, and I should mention, Richland County is a tiny county, and one of the unfortunate things, and I'm sure Michelle will agree with me, with how this system is set up, is some counties have a lot of funds available and they can give people whatever they need. Other counties don't have that funding available, so they need to be more selective about who gets what. So this is a very tiny county, Richland, the area of Mansfield, Ohio. So they don't have a lot of services available, but what they did have were some money from the state called multi-system youth funding. So we were getting kind of a patchwork of funding for the boys so they could have respite coming into the home to help give mom a little relief. Unfortunately, that was temporary. It would end after 90 days. Mom would lose the provider and it would take 2 or 3 months to get another provider. We went through an assessment back in October and we're told that these services were an alternative community-based service that was meeting her needs. We disagreed with that, so we filed an appeal, had a hearing in December, and at that point in time, the hearing officer decided that because the needs were so great and because this patchwork funding really wasn't meeting the needs, that those children had immediate needs. So now we're working with the county. It looks like we're going to get waivers for both boys. So just because they say that alternative community-based services are meeting your needs, if you don't agree with that, you should definitely appeal. So I should also mention that when you go through the waiting list assessment and you get a determination, and maybe you agree with that, maybe you don't want to appeal, but then your situation changes. Let's say you have a change in 30 days after that. Maybe your caregiver is lost or they're not as available as they may have been previously. You can always ask for another waiting list assessment where they can take into account whatever your new situation is. So I would encourage you to do that if you don't file an appeal. I think, and I'm sorry I don't have a PowerPoint today, we are working on getting some materials professionally published on Know Your Rights regarding waivers and provider issues, some briefs. So when those are just about ready to go to the designer. So when we get those officially released and our funder gets an opportunity to see those, we can certainly provide those materials to you. It kind of walks you through some of what I've talked about and a lot of other things that, that Michelle covered. There also will mention natural support. So you may hear that term coming up when you're having a waiting list assessment. The easiest way to describe natural supports is their help and care that somebody gets from their friends, family, or community without having to pay for anything. So, you know, if you live with mom, it's possible and probable that mom probably helps with your laundry, probably helps you grocery shop, maybe drives you to medical appointments and other things. So if you have those supports available, they're going to take that into account. Again, though, if it looks like natural supports are becoming too much for mom and dad or whoever the caregiver is, and maybe you can't provide those anymore, then that's something that needs to be brought out in the waiting list assessment and taken into account. I should also mention that they're not compulsory where adults are concerned. So your mom and dad don't have any absolute responsibility to take care of an adult child. Where minor children are involved, natural supports are compulsory. However, what you need to look at there is whether the care is extraordinary. So whether it's going way beyond what the care for an average, say 5 or 8 year old would be, which is the situation for the children that I described. That was a very high level of care and it ended up meeting that immediate needs standard. So that's basically how the new waiting list assessment is working right now. And I believe all of those new waiting list assessments, there were people on a transitional list. They should have been completed by December 31st of 2020. I think that's happened by now. But of course, everybody coming and now applying as a new person would have to go through that assessment process as well.
Rebecca, I know you spoke about the appeal process when a waiver is denied. How would a parent or guardian, or really anybody, begin the appeal process? Who would they call?
So Michelle mentioned due process, right? So what happens when you get the denial is from the county, you should receive some information explaining how to appeal. There are several ways that you can appeal. You're appealing to the Job and Family Services Department. So you can do that online. You can do that by calling their consumer access number, which is 866-635-3748. You can email them at bsh@jfs.ohio.gov. I would encourage you to put state hearing request in the subject line. BSH gets many emails per day. I don't think they usually have a chance to even check the email every day, but so putting that state hearing request in the subject line helps. You can fax it to 614-728-9574, or you can do old-fashioned snail mail, which I don't really recommend, particularly right now with the way our mail system is running. But if you want to do that, that's going to be sent to the ODJFS Bureau of State Hearings, P.O. Box 182825, Columbus, Ohio, 43218-2825. And your appeal should, when you're sending in your appeal, it's important to include your name, of course, your current address, and the case number assigned to you, a phone number where you can be reached, particularly now when they're doing all the hearings by telephone, the date that you got that notice, and why you're requesting a hearing. And so the deadline to file an appeal If you're asking for any benefits you have to continue, you need to file that appeal within 15 days of the mailing date of the notice. If you're not asking for benefits to continue, you do have 90 days. So you have a pretty good amount of time to get your appeal filed. There is kind of an under-level process that you can go to called a county conference. So when you submit your appeal, they will ask you if you also want a county conference. It doesn't replace your appeal or your hearing, but it's an informal meeting with the county board. You can also do this on other cases as well. And it's an opportunity to see whether you and the board can resolve the problem with the hearing. If you can't, then your hearing's going to go forward as planned. Hearings used to be, we've always had the option of doing hearings by telephone. Now with the coronavirus going on, all the hearings are going on by telephone. So you just need to make sure that you let them know what your current telephone number is so that they can contact you for the hearing. They seem to be working well. There are sometimes, as you would guess, technological glitches where sometimes you lose one party or the other. Sometimes you lose the hearing officer. But I think by and large, they're running pretty smoothly. And the hearing, you're not going to get a determination of whether or not your appeal has been upheld at that hearing. But what happens is the hearing officer, and particularly on these cases, I think they're much more complex than the average case that comes in front of the hearing officer. Some hearing officers aren't really all that familiar with the waiver and the waiting list process because it's a fairly new process. So I've found that usually when we have one of these hearings, it takes a good 3 or 4 weeks usually to get a decision, and that decision will come out in writing. If it's not in your favor, you have another level of appeal where you can file an appeal within 15 days. If that decision is upheld, your next step would be an appeal to the Common Pleas Court, and you're really probably going to need an attorney at that stage of appeal because that's particularly complex level of appeal. And you have 30 days to file an appeal to the Common Pleas Court.
Thank you for that information, Rebecca. Would you mind just dropping the phone number and the email address for filing in the chat?
Sure.
And also, just so that everybody knows, Michelle Meyerholtz shared her information. So if you do have questions about the county board and the waiver process, she would be happy to answer those. So we also have Jane Wagner here today, who is going to speak to us about the Ohio home care waiver. So Jane, if you could tell us a little bit about what that waiver is and what services it covers, that would be awesome.
Okay. I'm trying to share my screen. Did it come across? Did the screen come across, Sherry?
It did now, Jane.
Okay, good. All right. So I'm going to talk about the Ohio home care waiver, it's a nursing home alternative program. It's for home and community-based services. And you actually, most people prefer to stay out of the facility. So that's what waivers are all about, doing home and community-based services. So the types of services, the more common ones, and there are more, which is personal care, homemaking, home delivered meals, emergency response system, home modification, vehicle modification, durable medical equipment, and state plan. Medicaid pays first. And I always stress that their Ohio Department of Medicaid has a payer sequence. If a person is Medicare eligible, that would pay first. If they have private insurance for a parent's work insurance, that would cover first, and you do have to get denials from those before the Medicaid would pay. Strict Medicaid pays next, and then the waiver pays last on that. Who is eligible for Ohio home care waiver? It's you have to be under age 60, and you have to have an intermediate or a skilled level of care. It's the same level of care that you need to be in to get into a nursing home, which is, they call it a nursing home level of care. Now, if you are part of the DoD system, you, or if you had a medical condition that has 3 what they call functional limitations that occurred before age 22, you must have a skilled level of care to be eligible for Ohio home care waiver. Otherwise, you would need to get onto one of the waivers that Michelle spoke about. I tell people that the best time to apply for those Ohio home care waiver is if you post-hospitalization immediately, at that type of thing. Within that 30 days, they're still having if they have skilled services in place. To have a skilled level of care, you have to have skilled nursing 7 days a week or therapy 5 days a week. And you can't combine the two. You can't say, well, nursing 3 days a week and therapy, PT 3 days a week and OT 1 day, that type of thing. No, it has to be skilled nursing 7 days a week or therapy 5 days a week. And there has to be what they call an instability of condition. And so again, post-hospitalization, or those are the time to apply if it's an ongoing situation for a child. They have to reside in the community and have a waiver need beyond what Medicaid state plan services provides. They have to be Medicaid eligible. And so who is not eligible, which is if service, and it mentioned about, services can be met by a state plan, and that they also call it core or base Medicaid. Sometimes they'll say, well, I've had referrals because they can't find staffing, that, if you're still eligible for it under Medicaid state plan, you're on a Medicaid HMO, that Medicaid HMO has to, they have to have contracted providers. They can also make a individual contract with a provider, a home health agency that can contract with them for an individual person. If you're not eligible for Medicaid, then you don't qualify for the waiver. Now, if you are part of the DD system and you would have a diagnosis that occurred prior to age 22 and you have 3 functional limitations, then we again have to have that skilled level of care, or we get a rule out from the county DODD. So that gives you a little bit about Ohio home care waiver. And be aware that this is real similar to what Michelle went over on some of the services and some of the eligibility, and I didn't want to duplicate what she was talking about. But waivers are what they call waiver alignment, and then, like we have passport for people age 60 and above, but since this group's for the younger people, I didn't go into that. State plan is if you have Medicaid, just because you have Medicaid, you're eligible to up to 14 hours a week of skilled nursing and aid. That's a combination. You can have with a prior auth up to 28 hours, and children can have more. And there are also additional hours that's post-hospitalization. For 60 days post-hospitalization, you can get quite a bit. You can have a non-parent, non-legal guardian, non-authorized member of a family can be the paid caregiver. What state plan does not cover is respite care. So that would be a waiver service. And then homemaking only. Okay, now state plan does cover homemaking that's incidental to personal care. So if they can clean the bathroom. If they're helping you with your bath, they can clean up, the bathroom, that type of thing. If they're helping you get dressed, they can throw the clothes in the laundry, you know, that type of thing. So there's things that they can do. They cannot go outside of your home. If the laundry is, you know, they can't take it to the laundromat for you. Also, state plan does not cover habilitative care. And I explain it, if you learned how to do something and you lost the ability, whether through maybe a car accident, traumatic brain injury, or so if a child was able to do something and was in that car accident and can no longer do it, that's called rehabilitation. But if they were never able to learn how to do it, then it's habilitative care. We have private duty nursing is available. You can get quite a bit of hours of private duty nursing, even more at post-hospitalization. And it does need to be medically necessary. There's an application, there's a skilled form that needs a skilled needs form. All of this information I did send to Dawn from rules and forms and applications. So you know, they would have all of that, and how to access this private duty nursing. It's typically for people that are on ventilators, tube feeding, suctioning, you know, maybe wound care, that kind of thing. And if it's more, it has to be more than 4 hours at a time, but less than 12 hours. So we've seen people that have literally had 12 hours a day of skilled private duty nursing. And then there's a health check program, and it's the children's health component of Medicaid for children under age 21. And then your child can receive medically necessary services. Health check is one of those interesting programs. Frankly, I never heard about it until about 2015 was the first time I ever heard about it. Of course, I worked with seniors mostly before that. And so at any rate, it is, your child can get equipment, and they do a lot of preventative stuff that you can get in services there, but be aware that you can also get some personal care for that child and services. And that's not always, if you look on the website, it doesn't always advertise that part, but you can definitely get that through Health Check. And I also want to talk about, they changed the name. It used to be BCMH. It's now called Children with Medical Handicap, CMH. And I put a link in this PowerPoint just so that you can access some information on this. But if you have like a work insurance for a child and you're having things that are not covered by your insurance, or you have huge copays that you would have to pay, this program should be explored. It's not a primary insurance and it's not necessarily Medicaid, but it is through the Department of Health. And I will tell you that it worked. My granddaughter was able to get on this, and they had other insurance, but the insurance would not cover this. And so it did cover her medical treatment for this. And so I do encourage people to check on that. So I know that I was trying to do it quick because of time frames, but hopefully this will give you some additional resources.
Thank you so much, Jane. So as Jane mentioned, we are at our hour mark. I want to thank everyone for joining. So we will have our frequently asked questions handout that will be posted on our website and the county boards, along with the PowerPoint presentations that were part of today's session, Rebecca's handouts that she had shared that will be coming from ABLE, and then the other resources that Jane mentioned as well. So all of that will be posted on both of our websites for you to reference. If anyone has additional questions that you feel weren't answered today, and as you're looking through the additional resources that we share, please don't hesitate to reach out. Michelle Meyerholtz shared her contact information in the chat, and you can also email me at dbentley, BENTLEY, at abilitycenter.org, and I would be happy to make sure your inquiry gets to the right person. So with that, I would like to thank you for being here and welcome you to join us next week, same day and time on Thursday at 10 a.m. and we will be talking about guardianship and the different levels and types. Thank you, everybody, and thank you to our panelists so much for your time. We appreciate all of you and the work that you do in the community.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'm going to type in this, our ADRN for that in your chat for applying. ADRN. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, guys. See ya.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you. Bye-bye.